Welcome to the second episode of Football Transfer Markets, where we provide insights about domestic transfer markets of different countries and jurisdictions. Today, our episode is about Russia. Our today's guest is the co founder and partner of Sila International Lawyers, excellent sports lawyer, well known both in internal market and internationally, and our great friend Yuri Zaitsev. Today will provide us with general insights about Russian football transfer market along with the recent amendments of the domestic regulations and some consequences resulted from the well-known restrictions which affected local football market. So, let's go.
Yeah, Yuri, thank you for coming to our new project. I'm really excited and delighted to have you here because you know my respect towards you, and I'm really happy to have such an experienced lawyer as you are and such an excellent human being you are. So it's a real pleasure for me. So
Hello, Ashot. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for these words about me. I hope I deserve it.
you really do. Every word counts and matters.
Thank you.
You know, so as we discussed earlier, we have 3+ topics to discuss. The first topic is domestic training compensation system in Russia. And the second one is common conditions and terms related to domestic transfers. Let's say if there are any conditional fees or other fees which might be interesting upon the free will of the parties that they conclude the contract. And the third one is about is there any employment contract standard form or type which is being enforced or not, or recommended or whatever by the league or Football Union of Russia. So these are the 3 topics that I would like to discuss with you today. And the fourth one, whatever you will decide, feel free to speak about. I will catch it up.
Yeah, so let's try to discuss these topics, and then we will see how discussion will lead us.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, if we start from topics of training compensation and solidarity contributions, here I can mention that historically the regulations of the Russian Football Union recognized all benefits for the clubs which train the players, the young players. So we always had in the regulations the training compensation in case of first professional contract. We always had training compensation in case of subsequent transfer of the player under 23, and we always had training and we always had solidarity contributions. So all these 3 benefits historically existed in Russia, but in 2023, the Russian Football Union changed its regulations, and now we have interesting system because the training compensation in case of first professional contract and solidarity mechanism do not exist anymore in the Russian Football Union. So they both cancelled, but the Russian Football Union still keeps the training compensation in case of subsequent transfer. But what happened with these 2 benefits which were cancelled by the Russian Football Union? It was decided to change it with the annual contribution fee. And now, instead of paying training compensation and instead of solidarity contribution, each club which signs the young player should pay this, we call it single annual contribution. So how it works? Let's see, director of the club, you decided to sign the young player at the age of before 23 years. So in this case, every year you must pay this fee, which is calculated based on the player's net income. So this income includes his salary, his bonuses, team bonuses, private bonuses, everything he has in his contract. Net amount will be the basis for this annual fee. So let's imagine you signed this player played in your team during 1 season, and at the end of this season, you must pay 2% of his income to all clubs which trained this player And it's interesting that if we're talking about training compensation, we know that training compensation usually split between all clubs which train the player between 12 and 21. So Russian Football Union changed these dates, these years, and they decided to benefit the clubs which train the player from 7 years then till 19. So they decided, they investigated the registration system, and they came to the conclusion that the most effective years of training of the players from 7 to 19. I don't know how they decided, but they did some research. For example, you paid, you as a club, you take 2% of the player's annual income. Then at the end of the season, you pay this 2% to the federation. And then federation, based on the player's passport, they split this amount between all clubs in the player's passport from 7 years old till 19.
So I have two questions related to the system. As I understood, the 2% which is going to be withheld and distributed to the clubs participating in players' trainings, it's a cumulative amount. Like the 2% is being divided. Let's say there are 10 clubs participated. This 2% is going to be divided between these 10 clubs evenly, or is there any change? Is there any amendment system like we have? Let's say, let's take as a focal point, let's take the solidarity mechanism of RSTP, FIFA RSTP. So we know that there is 5% from 5%, etc., depending on the years of development. Is there this kind of mechanism, or this 2% is being distributed evenly between the clubs?
No, it's distributed based on the special system approved by the Russian Football Union. So, generally speaking, each club, let's say we have 100% of the annual fee. The club paid this 100%, and then from this 100%, every club from 7 years old to 14 years old, which trained the player during this period, for each year, the club receives 6% of the entire amount. And then after 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, it's 10.4%.
So in short, we can summarize as follows, that Football Union of Russia decided to find the players' established criterion of the development age as 19 instead of 21. Am I correct or not?
Yeah, it's correct. I don't know why, because even if we see the system of football, now I'm talking not as a lawyer, I'm talking as a football fan. Mm-hmm. What I see, the coaches and the clubs, most of the coaches, it's part of mentality, they do not consider the player as established player in 19, 20, and I very often I meet the coaches who say the player at 21, he's not ready to play in the first team. He's too young. So I don't know why the Football Union of Russia decided that the players are established at the age of 19, because really football society is not ready to recognize the players at this age as established player, especially in Russia. Yeah, and we know that somewhere in Ajax, for example, if the player is 21 or 22, he's too much old for this club. But in Russia, the specificity of football demonstrates that at the age of 20, and the player 21, 22, the player is still young, and the coaches really do not rely on these players as established players.
Well, I suppose this is more related to the perception of the culture, because speaking as a fan, we know that the players' peak performance is between 25 and 28 and 9, right? And generally speaking, statistically speaking. So maybe there is a misconfusion between the terms of established players we understand as lawyers, and as a developed player who is at his peak performance to contribute at his highest potential for his entire career. So I suppose it's more or less related to this cultural perception, because I really understand what is this what is behind this mentality. It's this misconception of what is the developed player in terms of established player, which is ready to participate in professional football, because nobody said that this professional player is going to play 90 minutes on the pitch. The young player can attempt to help his club by being substituted at the latest minutes, so this this may be
We know, we know, and we just saw Euro 2024 where
Yamal,
the
yes.
players Yamal was.
And Yamal is actually a great example, of the article of FIFA RSTP's ruling about the exception of the established player, where it says yes. And the jurisprudence, the FIFA existing jurisprudence, right? So Yamal, in my understanding, complies with all the criteria, not just one, like all the.
Yeah.
So he's perfect example for this rule. And
if we are talking about the age where this fees are distributed between the clubs, it's interesting to look at the history of the question, how Russian Football Union increased these periods where the clubs are benefited for the training of their players, because initially it was like in FIFA, the age between 12 and 21. Then they changed a little bit. They started to calculate from 10 to 21, and now we see that again they changed the
switch back, yes.
benefit from 7 to 19. So,
and the second question I have related to this topic is, well, you said that you do not know, but maybe, I don't know, just some thoughts, because this change which you described is far, far away from the FIFA RSTP's mechanism, which is used as a focal point or template for many federations around the world, we know. But is there any kind of justification of this amendment? Like, is there any circular about this amendment, or any, at least public opinion of any authority? Why this change was made? Is it related to, I don't know, any foreign factors, or it's something that the union decided to analyze?
I analyze. I understand your question. So what I know from inside, the idea was to benefit the clubs for training of the players based on the level of the players they actually trained. And here, the more salary the player has, more stronger the player is. So
the logic behind it is very simple. If you are going to pay high salary to the player, then
the higher salary the player has, the better the player is, and therefore I think that it's really very hard to calculate this training compensation, because if we look at the FIFA system, especially for Europe, who can say that the training of the player can cost 30, 60 or 90 thousand euro per year? So it depends on each concrete player. And before, in the system of Russian Football Union, it was a fixed amount for each year. And for example, they had 20,000 rubles, which is before it was 20,000 rubles per year. It was just 200 euro, so which is nothing. And the Russian Football Union was looking for fair criteria how to calculate this amount of compensation, and finally they concluded that the most fair criteria is the player's salary. So but it's important that these 2%, they are not withholded from the player's salary. They should be paid extra.
Let's say in FIFA's language, it's 100+% system.
Yeah, exactly.
But I cannot resist myself to ask you this question because both of us are sports lawyers. So the first thing that comes to our mind, I think this question is quite relevant in this case. Are there any restricted mechanism for the circumvention of this rule? Because I already see the following way. You were speaking about the system for the first professional contract, right? So right away, I'm just describing you an example. Locally assigned club category 3 or 4 or whatever signs the first professional contract of the player with super low salary with the minimum wage. Then the player plays there for 6 months, and then the player is being transferred as a free agent to the real club who was the ultimate beneficiary owner of the player's professional status, and there was an initial agreement between these two clubs. Is there any regulatory mechanism to prevent this kind of things, or?
Look, first, you cannot exclude cheating in football.
Yeah, I know.
We all know that in case of international transfers, the transfer to club full category works perfectly. I think it's possible. As a measure to prevent this, of course, the Russian Football Union recognizes breach transfer. They took the same breach transfer concept as FIFA. But again, by default, they consider as a breach transfer two transfers with 16 less than 16 weeks between them. But as you told, it's possible to transfer the player to the lower
for 6 months.
For 6 months, for half the year. Yeah, probably it will work. But then it will be obligation of the club who believes he suffered from this cheating.
Yeah, as a prudent businessman, to collect evidence, demonstrate it in front of the NDRC, and try to challenge. Challenge that.
And here I think also in Russia we have very interesting concept of the training compensation for each subsequent transfer of the player under 23, because we also have very interesting mechanism of calculation, how to calculate this training compensation. And frankly speaking, it can be quite big money. So how they calculate it? They take the player's salary for the entire period in the last club. Then they take the salary, they take all taxes which the club pays from the salary, and they take medical expenses which the club had to cover this player. Then they receive the entire amount, and this entire amount shall be multiple with the coefficient of new club. If we are talking about the Premier League, it's coefficient 3. So,
like in the previous system you had.
Yeah.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, but there were 3 coefficients. First category was 3 multiplied by 3. Second one, if I'm not mistaken, 2, or 1.5. I don't remember. And the third one was either 1.5 or 1. There was a system that it was being taken into account both from where the player comes and where the player goes. So I suppose what you are describing at the moment, this system was constructed based on the skeleton of the previous regulations we had, because this coefficient of multiplied by 3 corresponds to the previous regulations.
Yeah, definitely. And if we are talking about young player who has quite big contract, in this case the compensation can be very high. For example, this transfer window, one young goalkeeper, Danil Hudyakov, from Lokomotiv Moscow, his contract was expired. And based on this mechanism of compensation, the training compensation for internal transfer was around $1 million. And the same training compensation based on FIFA mechanism for him was around 350,000 euro. And of course, instead of signing new contract inside Russia, because it was impossible, nobody was ready to pay this.
What about waivers? What about waivers?
Yeah, just a second. Yeah, so he signed the contract with Football Club Sturm Graz from Austria because it was quite cheaper for foreign club to take this player. Yeah, waivers.
Yeah, this is interesting actually. So in other words, the player was transferred abroad and then came to Russia in order to.
No, I don't think he will come back because his dream was to play in Europe. But his agent was looking for the clubs inside Russia, and he didn't find anyone because the training compensation was too high. And his previous club, you asked about the waivers. Waivers are possible, but who wants to waive his rights to get 1 million?
So of course, but this what you just described is the perfect example that many people are talking about, that the training compensation actually prevents the player's development. It not like it should balance.
Yeah, but interesting that more than 10 years the Russian Football Union works the rule which also works in transfers inside European Union, that the club keeps the training compensation only if this club offers new contract to the player. If the club doesn't want to offer new contract, so in this case the club loses his rights for training compensation.
And it makes absolute sense because not offering the contract demonstrates that the club is indeed not interested in the services of the player. So
exactly.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah, so we found very interesting news of the concept, about the concept that exists at the moment, and let's see how will it justify itself in the near future. And the second question I would like to talk about with you is about domestic transfer fee types, or let's say mechanism common for Russian internal market. What you saw, what you agree with, what you would like to say about it, your general thoughts.
Yeah, so first, what I see at this moment, due to current situation with Russia as a country, it became more and more complicated for Russian clubs to bring foreign players. So Russian league always had a lot of foreign players, and now they are very limited to find new players because, for example, European clubs that doesn't want to sell players to Russia. European players doesn't go to play to Russia, and now the markets from abroad, we can say that there is only Latin America market, there is Balkans market, and partially Africa, and that's it. And since Russian clubs, they are very limited in international transfers, the local market significantly increased. So what we can see that there are a lot of transfers from Russian clubs to Russian clubs of the Russian players, and the price of these transfers quite high, and local transfers became more and more important for Russian clubs. If we're talking about transfer fees, there is nothing specific here. So we have standard transfer fees.
You mean fixed loan?
The fixed the fixed fees, and we have also conditional fees. But again, here we don't have any specific specificity comparing to what I see in other countries. The clubs, what they usually do, they put conditional fees based on the number of matches of the player in new club, number of goals, the title. For example, if you sell the player to Zenit, of course, you will insist to put the special bonus if Zenit will become champion. In this case, you must receive extra fees for transfer of your player. So, again, nothing specific. But what I see, two interesting issues. The first one, if we're talking about international transfers, we have a lot of transfers with buyout, and it's connected with the current restrictions. Let's imagine the situation. The Russian club wants to buy the player from some club. They come with the offer, and the club says, yeah, probably we are ready to sell this player to you, but we have the owner from USA, or we have the owner from, let's say, Germany, or any country which does not accept the transactions with Russia. And in this case, the club says, we cannot sell you the player, but what we can do, the player can buy his contract himself. So the player can bring us the money, and he can exercise buyout option in his contract. And then the lawyers come to the arena, and then it's for the lawyer's task to structure this deal so that the player receive the money to buy his contract from his previous club. These deals are very complicated, but they're really challenging and they're really interesting. But I see the tendency of the local market. There are more and more deals like this with buyout option when the player comes to Russia using buyout option in his previous club. And the same works on other direction when the club wants, for example, it happens with the player from one Latin American player who just left CSK Moscow. So, and he joined the club in Mexico. So, we know that Mexican bank system is very connected with USA, and it's impossible to get transfer money from Russia to Mexico. So what they did, they agreed that the player buys himself from CSK Moscow, and then he joins club in Mexico. So how it works. Another interesting issue in Russian transfers is the transfers of young players, because at this moment we have very, very strong academies of some football clubs like Zenit, CSK, Krasnodar. They really have a lot of young and talented players, but we know that from each year of academy, one, maximum two players can reach the main team, and what they can do with other players. What they do, they release these players for free, but when they release these players free of charge, in transfer contract, they put buyback option. For example, they see there is a club of the second part of the championship, so the club without strong ambitions, they release these players to this club for free, and then they put, for example, buyback option for $500,000. And when they realize that the player is already strong, and for the first team of this club, they just exercise this option, pay the fees specified in the contract, and then they buy this player back. So it's interesting mechanism how the clubs improve their players using other clubs of the Premier League, but at the same time they pay extra costs for their own players. from their academies. So yeah, it's an interesting system, but it really works. And recently, I had a lot of transfers like this.
About this buyback option, I'm sure you know that it's quite controversial from many
Yeah, I know.
perspectives.
I know.
But I want to ask you one question related to your own thoughts. And this is going to be hard to answer because, objectively speaking, it absolutely depends on which side you represent as a lawyer. But let's assume we are judges. Just let's try to be as objective as possible. I would like to know your thoughts about reviewing of the buyback option within the framework of third-party influence forbidden by RSTP. What do you think? Is this, I mean, of course, surely we understand that that purely depends on the wording used in the contract. But let's assume let's analyze the simplest buyback stipulation, okay? So we are in privilege to buy the players' registration rights back to us. Something like this, very, very simple. So within this meaning, what do you find that these kind of clauses actually can be subject to disciplinary proceedings in FIFA for the violation of third-party influence rule?
You know, I saw so many FIFA stupid decisions in this regard, so I would never be surprised if once they will punish the clubs using buyback option. Yeah, just example. One of the Russian clubs, they were sanctioned by FIFA for breach of TPI rules because in their employment contract with the player, there was a buyout option, and amount of buyout for some countries, like for example, they put 1 million for Italy, Spain, and so on, and they put 2 million for Saudi Arabia and Emirates. And FIFA saw this contract and told, look, this is TPI, and sanctioned them.
But how?
Because
I mean, excuse me, let me rephrase myself. How can it be TPI if it just regulates the employment relations between the player and the club? Who influences to whom? I mean,
because the clubs from one leagues has more privilege to buy this player than the clubs from other leagues. Yeah, again, I just made it as an example of some FIFA stupid decisions. And if we're talking about
in other words, the problem here is that you put, by saying you, I mean the club. The club puts the player in a situation where the club creates unequal, unfair market within the market. Am I correct or not? It's somewhat like this, because in my practice I didn't encounter this kind of decision, and I'm very, very careful when working. I'm very careful with TPO and TPI because okay, we know that there are some times where the club say, okay, we know TPI, but we need it. I mean, they calculate and decide to enter into this risk. But what you just told me, I mean, you must have some kind of a legitimate expectation, legal certainty to what you are doing to. And
it's complicated. And if we are coming back to buyback options here, yeah, of course, the matter is complicated, and probably in some points, especially due to specificity of wording, of each concrete wording, FIFA may sanction the club. But recently, a few months ago, one of the football clubs asked us, guys, please prepare for us legal opinion for implementation of buyback option. And frankly speaking, I didn't find any example when the club was sanctioned for buyback option. But of course, we thought about it, and we thought that it can be a breach of TPI. And here, if we are talking about buyback option, also it's interesting that's the one who can destroy buyback option is the player, because two clubs in their transfer agreement agreed that the player will be back for some fixed amount.
Yeah, and the player can just
And then the player says, but guys, but I don't want.
and you can't do anything in this case, absolutely. And this is
But
more
even in this regard, regarding buyback option, I found one case. There is only one case of buyback option in our database, and I think that at the CAS website as well. I didn't find any other, but in this case, the arbitrators came to the conclusion that if the transfer agreement or any document signed between the club and the player contains essential negotiation for future contract, in this case, when the buyback option is implemented, the player is bounded by his previous club by the contract. For example,
because he participated in the first initial transfer. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So, and if they agreed that the player will be hired as a football player, they agreed the term, they agreed the salary, and other essential conditions. In this case, in my opinion, FIFA will support existence of the employment contract.
Yeah, Clark.
Yeah, but again, it's interesting mechanism.
Yeah, about just a small remark about conditional fees. Is it common in a Russian domestic market to have? Well, this is more employment related matter, but in any way, is it common to have loyalty bonus for the players?
I wouldn't say it's very common, but in some clubs they have it. Yeah, especially I cannot say that it was very popular before, but after 2022, when Annex 7 appeared, and when foreign players they received the right to suspend the contract with Russian club, after 2022, and after this Annex 7, I saw that many clubs they put loyalty bonus to their contracts, and the players, especially foreign players, they can be paid with this loyalty bonus every 6 months.
It makes sense.
At the end of every transfer window. So I don't think that it's just the money on the top, but when the clubs, when they extended the contracts with the player, they just split the salary. Before it was just annual salary, and then they split it between monthly salary and loyalty bonus. If you stay in the club at the end of the transfer window, if you didn't suspend your contract, please get your money.
Yeah, makes absolutely makes sense, because the restrictions that are imposed, yes, for the clubs, this is some kind of a tool or mechanism to keep the player and render his services,
Yeah.
Well, the third question I would like to know your opinion is about so-called standard employment contracts, usually enforced or maybe not enforced, but recommended by the Premier Leagues, football federations. So how is it being practiced in Russia? How is it being done?
Yeah, the answer is very simple. We don't have standard contract, mandatory standard contract in Russia. So there is only recommended template of the contract, and usually only small clubs, they use this standard contract. But the clubs who has
Legal
We
department.
have the legal department, and according to licensing rules, all clubs of top division and all clubs of the first division, which follows the top division, they according to licensing rules, they must have legal department. So
This is very, very interesting. I didn't know about that because
this is criteria.
this is because this is not because this is not something in common, because UEFA's club licensing and financial sustainability regulations do not set this condition as a mandatory. So we can assume that Football Union of Russia decided to go even beyond and stipulated this as a supplementary condition for licensing, which is good. If you ask me, this is something good, because let's be honest, football regulations are becoming more and more complicated, and we have many cases where the existing especially in the cases of training compensations, we have many situations where the jurisprudence of FIFA says something, but the regulations may cause some confusion for the one who reads it. So yeah, it makes sense. This was very interesting, because this is the first time I hear about that, but it absolutely makes sense.
It's interesting when we don't have a standard contract, it's space for the lawyers to work. Because, for example, two biggest sports in Russia, one football and second ice hockey. And for example, our law firm, Sila, we have a lot of clients in football, and we don't have clients in ice hockey, only for specific matters like discipline cases and doping. And that's it. We never had any ice hockey players who came to Sila asking, guys, help me with the employment contract, because in ice hockey league, they use standard contract.
But is it mandatory or not?
Yes, it's mandatory. They completely took NHL system. And in this contract, you can just put the dates of the contract and the salary.
But obviously, they do not undertake any liability or responsibility for
of course,
the contract, right?
Of course not. So maybe one day we can do a separate podcast about ice hockey in Russia, because it's interesting how they implement it. We have this employment system like in most of European countries, and actually it was copy paste from German labor system many years ago, and in this system we still have freedom of movement,
and also abuse of dominant position by Ice Hockey Federation.
we still have the fundamental rights of the employee. But on the other side, it's interesting how the Russian Hockey League, they just copy-pasted the system of NHL. And for example, even having the standard contract, which you signed with the club, they use exchange system, like in NHL. One day, you wake up in St. Petersburg or in Moscow, and the club says, we just exchange you to Novosibirsk or to Omsk. Thank you so much. You go there.
But listen, from my part, jokes aside, like really, what do you think? If the federation enforces an employment contract onto the parties and doesn't undertake any liability arising thereof, isn't it? Well, it's a complicated matter, I know, but aren't there any signs of abuse or dominant position?
Yeah, of course there is.
I mean, because, well, it's, I would understand if the federation would say, okay, guys, this is my contract, but I also undertake liability for the validity of the contract. But if it's not...
But we know there are federations which implement employment contract, and then you can do whatever you want with amendments. Like this summer, I helped to the Russian football player who signed the contract in France, and in France they have standard employment contract, which is quite simple, just few pages, and then the club signs with your player amendment for
And the amendment is not being verified or supervised. Let's say the league or federation doesn't analyze the amendments to the extent they would analyze the initial employment contract. Am I right?
yeah, exactly.
Quite very, very feasible and smart solution, I suppose. Yeah, excellent, brilliant. Yuli, and the fourth question is up to you. What would you like to discuss? We know that Russian market right now has specificities upon the Annex 7 because of the Annex 7 of RSTP. Actually, I'm not aware. I would like to ask you, did you challenge the Annex 7 per se? Or if not, was there any case that you challenged, not the Annex? Well, let me rephrase myself. I'm not speaking about challenging the Annex 7 upon the Swiss Civil Code as FIFA's decision as an association to adopt a decision. I'm not speaking about this direction because you have 30 days to do that. And obviously, I don't think that within these 30 days, some of the stakeholders decided to challenge it initially.
Actually, they did. Actually, they did. It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting saga because in 2022, early March 2022, the Russian clubs became in a difficult situation, but the Ukrainian club, they appeared in worse situation because, for example, the first edition of Annex 7 for Russian clubs just allowed the players to suspend their contracts. And in respect of Ukrainian players, what FIFA did, they automatically announced all contracts suspended, regardless the will of the clubs and the players. So, it caused a lot of problems, for example, to such clubs like Dynamo Kiev and Shakhtar Donetsk. And there were two appeals against FIFA decision. One appeal was from Russian clubs. There were 6 or 7 clubs which challenged before the CAS Annex 7, and there was Shakhtar Donetsk who also challenged this Annex 7 before the CAS.
But through the route, I was speaking within these 30 days as a decision.
So both appeals were admissible, but both appeals were rejected by the CAS. Still, if we will discuss here legal arguments, it will take another hour. It's complicated to do within these formats. Here what I can conclude that both appeals were rejected, but after the CAS award, Annex 7 was significantly changed by FIFA. So they kept the same wording, but what they did in 2023, they did in 2023. In last edition of Annex 7, it was written that now this annex covers only the players who suspended their contracts in 2022. So
yeah, I know, and they continue they continue this way because at 2022
new players who sign in 2023, 2024, they are not able anymore
to benefit from it. I know, because in 2022 we had a case in one of Armenian clubs that the player suspended. I mean, upon notice with every requirements, he suspended his contract with the Armenian club.
Yeah, we understand the situation. We can accept it or we cannot accept it. It's the matter of dialogue. But really, some clubs and some agents, they really abused Annex 7 because the typical discussion between agent of foreign player and Russian club, and I'm sure that Ukrainian clubs say they had the same problem. The typical discussion was, guys, please pay me 1 million as an agency commission, and the player will not suspend his contract. It was just the reason for the agents to blackmail the clubs, and if the club refused to pay, suspended, and that's it. And I don't know how it finished. Maybe they're still in the court, but one of the football players who suspended the contract with Shakhtar Donetsk, and he joined another club, and then this club, who was just temporary club for this player, they sold this player, and they earned some millions for this player, who belonged to Shakhtar Donetsk, and they're still in the courts with this club. So,
well, Annex 7 per se is quite complicated topic, if you ask me, because in the same way as we are coming back to the TPI case we were speaking about, like if you find that there is an influence when you put me in front of a position that I create an unfair situation in the market, within the same way I am right now alongside with the Ukrainian clubs in the unfair situation among compared to other federations. So the Annex 7 per se is problematic. And speaking about objective justification to implement this decision is, as you said, it's a matter of a whole podcast, because it's quite a complicated topic. And is there anything else?
and what I just can conclude that Ukrainian players, clubs, they suffered with Annex 7 even more than Russians, and it was unfair towards them.
Yes. And is there any other topic you would like to cover about Russian internal market, agents, I don't know, or whatever you deem necessary or interesting?
It's interesting about the agents regulations, because I think that Russia is the last country in the world, and Russian Football Union is the last national federation in the world which did not suspend the agent regulations as FIFA did, because we know that in December 2023, FIFA suspended some points of its regulations due to the multiple courts proceedings in different countries like Germany, Brazil, UK, and so on.
By the way, excuse me for interrupting you. You know what I noticed actually in the suspension circular? Did you see that FIFA actually didn't suspend the regulations related to the acquiring of the license, like examinations, etc., etc.,
Yeah.
but it suspended the Article 21 of the FFAR, which actually speaks about disciplinary proceedings against the agent in case of violations of the FIFA rules and regulations. So this is very interesting topic actually, because in one hand you have the process of licensing, but on the other hand you suspend the regulations which are affecting the violations by the agent. So, and you grant some kind of a leverage to be out of your control. So what I try to understand, wouldn't it be more logical to suspend the processing of acquiring the license as well?
Yeah, maybe, but what I see at the market, FIFA license, again, I'm not speaking now as a lawyer, I see as a person who works in sport, and FIFA license really became important for the football agents, because even if it doesn't give you a lot, it gives you some kind of legality to act as a FIFA agent. And for the clubs, all clubs in Russia before, even before when we had only Russian Football Union regulations, they didn't care, and most of the clubs, they didn't care if you have a RFU license or not. Just bring someone with a license and we will sign the contract. But now they stopped speaking with the agents who doesn't have FIFA license, and for them it became something important. So yeah, I think that FIFA did a lot of mistakes recently in terms of the agents regulations. They canceled it in 2015. Then they did nothing. Then the agent market changed during this period since 2015, changed significantly, and then FIFA came back and put very, very strict regulations. The market was not ready.
Yeah, historically compared, so the new one compared to the older one, the new one is much, much stricter for the agents.
Yeah, probably they needed to act step by step. But the system with FIFA football agent licenses, for me, the market accepted this, and it became important for the clubs to work with the agent who has a license.
And
What I see at from my practice.
as you said, Football Union of Russia didn't suspend the application of FFAR.
No, and
And what is the justification?
justification, just we don't want to do this. We are okay with, especially with limitations of the commission. And now the clubs and the agents, they're really in a stupid situation. When you have internal transfer, there is 3% cap on the commission. And when you have external transfer, where FIFA regulations apply, no cap. And you can do whatever you want.
Well,
And it's,
let's say, statistically speaking, right now, what I heard, Russia is the best place to get the statistics, what's going on. So there is also a positive part of that, because I believe that maybe there will be some amendments to the regulations, but the regulation will stay in force. I mean, not now, maybe after the year, 2 years, but I don't believe that the regulations will be found null and void in their entirety. You know what I mean? Maybe.
no, of course not.
Yes.
I'm sure that FIFA will find the balance. We all know the history of the regulations on the transfer, on the status and transfer of players. We know how the system was unstable after Bosman case. We know how FIFA adapted very difficultly to find the balance, and finally they did it. Now we can
Which is challenged now.
yeah.
It's
Let's
challenged.
see.
Right now, you know. It's all again. It's
Yeah.
challenged. But I think it will remain the same,
Yeah.
because let's say right now we look at the global market, and more or less, okay, there are some controversies, okay, but the system is stabilized, so the system works. Maybe some people don't like it or like it, but it's not matter to like or not. The system objectively works, and statistics and FIFA reports, which are being published from time to time, speak about that.
Yeah.
So it works.
So, yeah, let's see.
Yes.
You see, we just touched the small part of the football law and how many interesting points we found just in one country, which is not the leading country in world of football. So,
Yes, and that's the reason
thank
that
you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for the idea of this podcast, because for me it's amazing to compare one jurisdiction to another, to understand the problems of other country. It's really interesting.
Yeah, because as I told, many people overlook this matter or whatever, but I believe that the development and balancing the football regulations rely on the comparative law. Why? Because we have unified governing body, which and we must not forget, right, that the Article 1 of RSTP stipulates some mandatory rules to comply with for all the federations. But even at this phase, we see that they deviate. So to find truth, we must compare. To find the effectivity, we must compare. So Yuri, as I expected, great podcast, absolutely amazing, because the level of experience and the level of knowledge is uncomparable. And Really, thank you so much for the trust and for coming and for sharing with your experience, with your vision, with your knowledge, because the quality is extremely high, and I assume any person who more or less is connected with football as a fan, as a practitioner, as a functional, as an official will definitely enjoy the information which is available here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And at the end, I just want to ask your listeners, please subscribe to this podcast.
Yeah,
Because it's
and also follow
interesting.
Sila Lawyers on the social media and everywhere. And by the way, we will have upcoming session with Marton Gies soon. So yeah, so we will speak about Hungary jurisdiction as well. So
Which is very, very interesting, especially in terms of local contracts and lack of local DRC. So,
yeah. Okay, thank you.
okay. Thank you so much, Ashot. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.